All right, everybody. So I'm going to get things started here. First of all, thank you for joining us today. My name is Brady Nordstrom, and I am the coordinator with Seattle for Everyone. So I'm just going to give a brief intro before I hand it off to our panelists. So in addition to our panel today, we'll be setting aside a good amount of time to have a small group discussion and a Q&A, which we're looking forward to. So we are excited and honored to be part of HTC's 2020 Affordable Housing Week. This Affordable Housing Week is focused on zoning. And as many of you know, zoning has powerfully shaped our cities and our neighborhoods. And whenever this comes up in a conversation, we have to remember that the foundation of zoning in the US was, since the 1920s, was exclusionary. This was explicitly directed at Black Americans and later the poor and other people of color. So we believe that zoning based on this artificial and harmful racial animus is not sustainable, neither morally nor technically. So reforming zoning then and land use is an important foundation to abundant housing, but in many respects, that reform will only succeed if it's paired with other changes to our housing system. So we must also fix common barriers to housing. So I'm just going to quickly go over the background of this issue and then, yeah, hand it off. So let's see here. So first of all, this is the situation that we're in. Jobs and population growth they're growing faster than housing. So if you look at this chart on the left here, you see since 2010 to 2017, we've had a 21% growth in jobs and a 12% growth in population, but the housing supply has only grown 8%. So that's problematic because, as you see in this chart over here to the right, rents are growing much faster than incomes, as well as other housing costs. So we want to emphasize that low-income housing, low-income affordable housing is needed most of all. And then, so from 2010 to 2017, the same time period, King County has lost 112,000 homes that were affordable to people earning less than 80% AMI. So this is despite a net gain in overall units, and it's due to a combination of factors, but down renting and other market distortions caused by this insufficient supply. So we also must emphasize that the affordable crisis is also an equity crisis. So if you look at this chart here, this is the percentage of cost burden King County households by race from 2017. And as you see, and just cost burden, as many of you know, is when you spend more than 30% of your income on housing expenses. So as you see here, Black households spend 56% of Black households are cost burdened. 51% of Hispanic households are cost burdened. And then if you go down to the bottom here, you see that only 35% of white households and 36% of Asian households, for example, are cost burdened. So there's equity implications for all of this. And also the need is great. So there's estimated 244,000 affordable homes are needed by 2040. And so we can use a bunch of different projections, but no matter which one we use, housing is needed in every income group and in staggering numbers. So yes, supply is a primary cause of the crisis, but always we have to remember that housing is about people and creating healthy communities. And we always must ask and remember to ask, who are we building this for? And how are we comprehensively including everyone in our solutions? So this leads us to our topic today. Shared barriers to housing. So despite the progress that's made by a whole bunch of groups, including nonprofit, private, and public organizations, this affordability and equity crisis continues. So why hasn't our response yet matched the deep need? So today, we're just gonna, the intro, which is now, wrapping that up. Then each of our 3 speakers will talk for 5 to 8 minutes. Then we're gonna go into breakout groups for 15 minutes, and we're gonna try and preserve some time at the end for Q&A. So all adjourning by 2 p.m. So meet our speakers. So first of all, we have Emily Thompson. She's a partner at GMD Development. So Emily has built broad expertise in real estate development over the last 15 years. This includes work with nonprofits, for-profits, and market rate developers. And currently, Emily focused on preservation and development of affordable housing in Washington, which includes 500 housing units under construction in Seattle. After Emily, we'll have Jessie Clawson speak. She is a partner at McCullough Hill Leary. So as a land use and permitting attorney, Jessie has deep experience navigating barriers to complex projects with an array of complicated urban jurisdictions. Her work has resulted in the permitting of tens of thousands of multifamily units in Washington cities, which includes Seattle. And then finally, we have Amy King, who's the owner at Square Peg Development and a CEO at Pallet Shelter. Amy is a local leader in social purpose construction. As the co-founder of Square Peg Development in 2014, this company focuses not only on a range of residential and commercial construction, but also on creating employment opportunities for the formerly incarcerated. Her various companies produce a range of different housing. So with this, I will hand it off to Emily and we'll get things started.
Great, thank you. 1 second, let me just minimize this here. I do not have any slides today, but Brady, thank you for including me as a panelist to talk about this housing crisis that we have. I think it's very timely. COVID has shown that the housing crisis that we're facing is not going to get better. If anything, it's getting worse with the changes in income to households in our area. So I want to talk about a few things today related to housing development barriers from my perspective as a private for-profit developer of affordable housing in the Pacific Northwest. I currently have 3 projects under construction in the city of Seattle. So my examples really are sort of based in the city of Seattle for the purpose of this today. The first thing I want to touch on is emphasizing that I believe that housing production at all levels of affordability really helps to contain rent growth. And I know Brady showed some data that, we're still having divergent, rent is growing higher even though we are producing units. But really producing housing at all levels of units does help. There's a recent study out of Washington, D.C. that showed that of the 2,100 units they've built over the last 2 decades, it helped to hold the rents down about $250 per month for the average monthly rent today. So I think Seattle has taken a good stance in trying to build its way out of our housing crisis, but clearly we're not doing enough, and we need to find a way to build more units more quickly and easier if we're going to reach those goals by 2040. The second point that I want to talk about really is the barrier of feasibility, of time and money to entitle and permit our projects. We have in our city really well-intended requirements and regulations that I think are trying to produce high quality housing and other development in our community. The problem is they're creating a staggering time and cost function to develop in Seattle, which pushes non-affordable development all to the super high-end luxury units, because that's where there's profit to be made, and that's the way that private developers can mitigate risk, and it's negatively affecting the affordable housing production that we could be having. The time, I think everyone can appreciate that the uncertainty and long lengths of time for entitlement and permitting cost money to a developer, and then you add on to that the fees, and it just becomes a very expensive barrier to develop in the city. And for affordable, and I should say that there have been some small changes that have helped affordable recently. For example, the temporary waiving of affordable projects to go through design review. And that's a huge step, but it's not enough. We need bigger changes and we need more changes. The difference for affordable housing, of course, is that the cost to develop is offset by public resources, both at the state and local level. So the expense to develop in Seattle versus another municipality is offset by scarce public resources. And wouldn't it be great if we could take those public resources and put them into new units rather than just have them go towards the additional cost it takes to develop in the city of Seattle? So an example, a recent project I worked on in South Seattle, that's a block from a light rail station, 211 units. So I think everyone can agree that's transit-oriented development. It's the kind of development we want to see in Seattle. We had a 2,600 unimproved dead-end street, I will call it. It was not a street. And it took 18 months to go through the street vacation process for that. And that was including getting Nathan, who's on the line, and former city council member Mike O'Brien involved to try to speed up the process. So it's, that just seems ridiculous to me. That same project is going to spend $250,000 on street rental fees. We have a 60-unit project that's going to spend $120,000 on street rental fees. I think we have to start asking some questions about, is affordable housing, is it a revenue center for the city, or can we really kind of break down some of these time and cost barriers so that those very precious public resources can go to the development of more units of housing? And, while I don't really love that a lot of the new development that's not affordable has been market luxury sort of high-rise units, I can appreciate that it's very challenging to develop in this city. And so I can understand why you would not want to take the risk to develop something where you didn't have the opportunity to make money. So the last point I want to talk about is the lack of departmental coordination. And I think, again, SDCI has made some really great strides in helping affordable housing, and I think in general, housing development over the last couple of years become more streamlined, but it's not enough. And quite frankly, the other departments are not focused on this coordination, not for affordable housing and not for the general coordination of housing development. SDOT, SCL, and SPU do not meaningfully include any expediting process for affordable housing, let alone for market rate developers, but to coordinate with each other to make the process more streamlined. They all work on their own timelines, and it's very challenging to get everyone to work together. We have a project where we recently discovered that what should be a 2 to 4 week typical timeline for SCL is now become 12 to 14 weeks. And we're really lucky. Our specific project is affordable housing, and we've been loud enough that we understand that it's being focused on at an interdepartmental level. But how does this affect other developers? And again, create barriers that developers don't want to develop in Seattle, or it's more expensive to develop in Seattle. And we need to try and address those issues from a more, I think, holistic perspective. And, sometimes I think that if it's this hard for me as an affordable housing developer in a city that is so focused on prioritizing the development of affordable housing, then if it's this hard for me, how do other developers do it who don't have the benefit of developing affordable housing with the political support that takes? So I think that if we can look at some of these issues, and I think that, I know that the city is focused on some of these things and the city departments are working on it. That's great, but until that's really the outcomes of some of those processes are felt by the development community, I think that the housing crisis is going to continue, and we really can't meaningfully address our housing production goals. So that's what I have to say.
Great. So this is Jessie Clawson, and I am sharing my screen, I think. Here we go. So thanks for that, Emily. And I think you said so many things that I could just keep riffing on without having slides to go for. You're completely right that, it's hard for everybody to develop housing, and it's not just Seattle. I mean, it's difficult in Bellevue that doesn't have as much of a focus on developing affordable. It's difficult in other jurisdictions. There are whole moratoria against any type of development, including the only place you could do apartments in Mercer Island right now. And Issaquah just got done with having one. Federal Way has insane impact fees on just multifamily development because they don't want anymore. So it's not just Seattle, but I think obviously this is a Seattle for everyone presentation, and so we'll focus more on Seattle. Not to pick on Seattle though, but I wanted part of I come in and I'm a land use attorney that works primarily with market rate developers. We do work, I'm on the board of and do pro bono work for Mary's Place, which is a different type of housing provider. Obviously, they don't develop, and also Lehigh and Capitol Hill Housing. So we do represent some affordable housing providers as well. And I can tell you 100% that everybody is experiencing the same thing in terms of how difficult this is. You know, market rate developers, I guess it's not a mystery, they are for profit, but they are, they still have to balance the checkbook, I say. The costs of development have to be less than the, you know, overall cost that they will actually make money off of the project. And then, so thereby, to keep rents lower, you have to actually reduce the cost of development. So that's one thing that we're really focused on, is how can we actually do that when you can't necessarily control the cost of land, and you can't necessarily control the cost of construction. The other thing that you can do is try to control the cost of regulation and time to market. I think, Emily, you also said, and maybe Brady, you did as well, the more units that are on the market at any affordable level, and I always say housing is affordable to somebody. I mean, yes, there are luxury units, but they are affordable to somebody, and newer units often get people out of a down renting situation where they're taking a lower cost unit away from somebody who actually needs it, right? The other thing is, you know, in most Puget Sound jurisdictions, just because of regulations, developers actually do contribute to deeper affordability, either through the MFTE program, in Seattle, the MHA program, and then in other places, you know, Redmond has a 10% affordable requirement, you know, paired with a fee in lieu if you want to do a fee in lieu. Same with Bellevue for incentive zoning. So they actually do contribute to the dollars most often that get distributed by Office of Housing and used by providers. So it's actually important, and I think that's part of what MHA was set up to do, for, you know, the more square footage of market rate development, the more MHA housing money will go into Office of Housing. And so you know, that's another, I think, good thing about just market rate development generally. So I didn't know Brady was actually going to talk about some of this, but, you know, increased entitlement costs, they kind of fall into certain buckets. There's zoning and design regulations, what I call health, safety, and welfare regulations like building codes. And then the other, which, you know, I was just thinking about it, it's incredibly complicated. I mean, insanely complicated to actually do one of these projects. It's almost a miracle sometimes, I think, when they come to fruition, from the beginning of tying up the land, and then just being able to read the regulations and, you know, design a project to them, and then going through the process and then actually constructing something. It's incredibly difficult. And obviously one of the biggest costs is time. The time cost of money when you have a loan on the land, or, you know, you're burning dollars every day, it really does add to the cost of projects. So Brady touched on this a little bit, but again, I get a little philosophical when I think about zoning, because it's kind of like, what were zoning laws for initially? And, you know, they were based in nuisance law, which was protective of the individual's right to peaceful enjoyment of one's property. So it's really about individual property owners, and, you know, banning certain uses from areas based on compatibility. So, and compatibility is kind of a, you know, a loaded word, and obviously devolved quite quickly from the first zoning regulations, which was about light and air and skyscrapers in New York City, to racially based, you know, keeping apartment people / people of color out. And, you know, obviously, I wouldn't say that our zoning code today is necessarily drafted in that way, but I always wonder, like, why do we care if a parapet is 4 feet tall? Or why do we care about the number of live work units? I mean, in Seattle, Title 23 of the Land Use Code, again, it is literally my job to interpret this thing. I will have a job forever as long as I want it. But it shouldn't it's not really fair that people should have to pay somebody like me to interpret the code or work with them on the code. And so in a lot of ways, it's a question of equity to me. And for what reason exactly? Then there are more subjective reviews. I mean, zoning codes can be more subjective, but design review is certainly something that is very subjective. You know, neighborhood character is always a guideline in every design review scheme, which is really protective of the existing and protective of, frankly, in some ways can be used to keep people out. Obviously, different people read and apply guidelines differently. So you really go into this process and you don't necessarily know what you're going to pop out with, and you don't know how long it's going to take. There have been changes recently to the Seattle Design Review Code that in some cases limit the number of meetings for market rate projects, and in COVID times, exempt entirely affordable housing from design review, which is incredible. But to me, that says that there's something wrong with design review, because why should some sort of housing have to go through it and some sort of housing not? And I posit that it is not actually about design. I just want to give a quick example about the impact on affordability for design review. Last night, actually, one of my projects was at the East Design Review Board online, and it's on a zone boundary and was required to just do a 10-foot setback arbitrarily. Design Review Board said, you know, we think 10 feet is the right number. And to preserve light and air to these neighbors up the slope. And, you know, that's a fine situation, I guess, or a goal to have. But what that does is reduce by, you know, several thousand square feet in this building. Rents will go up in that building, you know, maybe incrementally, tiny bit, but it still will. And the amount of MHA payment from that building will go down. So it's like, for what and why? And then, you know, there's the uncertainty of what's going to happen later. So, you know, the solutions, I think at least the three of the speakers are probably on the same page. I would say that getting rid of very subjective regulations is one of the biggest things you can do. If I can open the code as a developer and see exactly what I can develop, and I have a lot of certainty in the time it's going to take, it's so helpful. And so, you know, I just question why we have these subjective regulations and then subjectively applied now to not sometimes apply to affordable housing. I mean, I think if we're trying to raise all of the units across the board, one of the big ways is to get rid of big subjective regulations like design review. So that is what I have to say. Amy, kick it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jessica. And I just echo all the things that both of you said. So thank you for sharing all of that. I'm going to power through my slides really quick. So I am Amy King, and if I can get my slides to move here. Hold on one second. Oh, sorry. Let me see if I can fix this. Okay, there. So I own and operate 3 different companies here in the Seattle area. Pallet, we make homeless and disaster response shelters for rapid response. They're panelized. Square Peg Construction, which is a social enterprise construction company that employs individuals that are exiting the criminal justice system. And then our nonprofit, which is called Weld Seattle, which provides housing, employment opportunities, and recovery resources to people that are transitioning back into society. Next week, Weld is going to be announcing the opening of 1426, which is a collaborative reentry resource center, which will include a construction trades training program, which we're very excited about, that's intended to develop and diversify the workforce needed to grow this supply. So we're very excited about that. We believe housing needs to be provided across the spectrum, like you've already heard here. Everything from shelter to a market rate, affordable luxury product. There's different people in different phases of life, and we need enough supply for everyone. Each of our companies sort of touches on most, but not all of these areas that we believe are on the spectrum. And certainly there's other small areas that aren't included here. So a couple different barriers that you've already heard about, so I won't spend a ton of time here. Obviously, Emily and Jessica did such a good job of touching on the things that I completely agree with that we face here in this city. But obviously, from a regulatory perspective, we've got zoning restrictions, permitting timelines, which you've already heard about, and the disjointment in the city organizations and departments where we've got crossover of fees and timing and all of that kind of stuff that really slows production development. On the finance side, obviously the cost of land is too high. We all know that. Our rate of return expectations are too high, which is something that I don't think we talk about enough. And by that, I'm not talking about the developers actually. Most people don't know that developers don't self-fund. They have lenders, they have finance groups that fund for them. And those finance groups expect a very high rate of return when it comes to real estate. That's understandable because there's a lot of risk associated with that money. However, if we're going to make an impact on this, we've got to be innovative in this space and incentivize things like social impact investing and really lower our expectations because as Jesse mentioned, you know, you've got the cost of time is really high because if projects sit too long, then you've got to pay extra interest and all of that. Those are things that a lot of people don't understand if they're not in development. Of course, the cost of construction is too high. A big part of that is that there's not enough of a workforce. So jobs are at a premium. Materials are incredibly high because of tariff wars. So all those things impact the cost of construction. And then adoption is the other piece, which we all know. NIMBYism is huge in our city and everywhere. And the fear of the unknown and the stigma around renting to people that are different than us. Access, so an area that we focus on really heavily here, obviously, is working with people that are impacted by the criminal justice system. So a couple really staggering facts for you. Obviously, 1 in 3 Americans have a criminal background. Most people don't know that. That's 100 million Americans that have been arrested by the age of 23 or have a criminal background. That equates to about $65 billion a year of lost GDP in people that aren't able to work or provide or find stable housing. So that's pretty staggering. So apart from affordability, which is an obvious barrier to access, we also have the barrier of people being unable to access housing because of their backgrounds or because of issues related to diversity and equity. So our nation's current housing system also perpetuates that cycle of poverty. We have seen this over and over again. So a lot of our low income projects that we develop across the country end up being on land that's cheaper or more accessible, which ends up being in communities that do not have a fair amount of investment in them. So what we find is people that already have poor access opportunity are returning to properties where there's activity that they can then get drawn back into. So we're dropping people back into the communities that they came from, which is not always helpful and just perpetuates that cycle of criminal justice involvement and poverty. So what's the solution? Well, from an affordability perspective, obviously we need to solve for that with policy making and incentivize investments. So what does that look like? Rethinking zoning, which we've already been very creative on, but more work needs to be done. Aligning city departments and organizations to help us increase that supply quickly and cost effectively. We need to embrace innovation and think about how we can do housing differently and open up our opportunity from a regulatory perspective to see that innovation implemented quickly. We need to identify underutilized land and incentivize its use for housing. And incentivize social impact investment and resource sharing. So for example, WELD helped with the city of Seattle with the vacant property legislation that incentivizes developers and property owners to donate their land for temporary use while it's awaiting permits. That has allowed us to house hundreds of people a year over the last 4 years in very creative ways. So we need to be doing more of that. From an access perspective, we need to solve for access with human interaction, supply surge, and bias conditioning. So policy is great, but it doesn't break down human bias. This is something we talk about all the time. You can create affordable housing, you know, coming out your nose, and if the landlord doesn't have an open mind to people with a criminal background or people with a history of addiction or bad credit, then that affordable housing isn't going to do anybody any good because you still can't get in it. So we're big believers in breaking down NIMBYism through targeted listening and learning opportunities, lots of town hall, things like that where we can expose people and break down that fear and bias. I also think we need to focus more on mixed income developments that allow for integration and diversity of communities so that everybody's benefiting from that. We need to identify and support wealth generating opportunities. So again, rental properties are great. That does not help people move out of poverty in a sustainable way. We have to think about home ownership. We got to be more creative and look at the legislation around condos and ways for people to get into home ownership, because that's how we generate wealth for our families long term. And we have to provide equal opportunity access to housing and employment and resources, because if you have a house but you don't have a job, you're not going to have that house very long. So it's really important for us to be thinking about housing as not just a place to live, but it's a place you have to sustainably live. So you have to have other resources, access to employment. One of the things we really want to see the city invest in is flooding the market with a non-traditional workforce, especially as it relates to construction. So investing in, and there's already been some investment in this, but we need more, investing in job training and employment opportunities for people that come from marginalized backgrounds so that they can be sustainably housed. So that's what I have to say about that. I'm all done. Thanks, Brady.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers today. So, so up next, we're going to have a breakout session. The rooms are closing officially in 18, 17 seconds. So as everyone gets back, what we're going to do, I want everyone to think about a question that you might have for our panelists, and we're going to spend the rest of these 15 minutes just doing a question and answer with everyone in the same room. So, so yeah, as everyone starts to trickle back in, feel free to enter any questions that you might have for our panelists into the chat box, and we'll just kind of take them from there. So it might be a minute or so as people type in their questions and think of them, but these can be questions that came up in your discussions or other questions that you might have personally. And I'll say it one more time, just in case people are getting in and settling in. We're taking live questions. Just enter your question into the chat box, and it could be from the session or a personal question, but we'll, oh, here we go. From Nathan Torgelson. Are there any efforts for SEPA reform as part of the next state legislative session? And this may be a question that one of our panelists can take, or yeah, someone else.
I believe so, Nathan. I know that I don't know the particulars and the specifics, but I know FutureWise is working on a package of amendments, related to affordability and to, permitting timelines and things like that, that may also have to do with SEPA, kind of like what happened in the last session, but pushing it a little bit farther. You might know something too from OAR.
Great, thank you for that. So next, we have a conversation, and if anyone doesn't know what SEPA is, it's the State Environmental Protection Act, and there's a review that projects have to go through according to that, and there's also, there's also an appeal process that's complicated that has to do with that, but that's what SEPA is. So the next question we have here, it's about political will. How can we muster the political will to end apartment multifamily bans in 75% of Seattle's residential land? And that's a common figure that I've seen around 75% of Seattle's residential land. It also matters on if you're taking gross or net land, but yep. Any of our panelists want to take that one?
No.
Yeah, how do we muster political will? I don't know. I guess that's a better question for our elected officials than for the three of us, in my opinion. But I think it has to start at the community level, in my opinion, which sounds daunting. And a lot of people say, I don't know what that means. How can I engage? I think if you want to see more affordable housing and you want this crisis to end, you have to engage in some way. You have to tell your council members, both King County and city, that you want to see something done and that you're demanding some action, right? We're only going to get political will if all the constituents start complaining, which I know a lot of people are, but most people are complaining from the standpoint of, I don't want that in my backyard. And they're listening to you and they hear that and say, well, I don't want my constituents to be pissed at me, so I'm not going to push this, right? And so we have to do something. It's already in our backyards. It's in everybody's backyard. We just have to accept it and make the changes. The political will really comes from all of us, though, and the business community. We have to do something and just accept that they're listening to you, so you have to say something.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would say, you know, if you look at least the Seattle City Council, even the most liberal members who you'd think would be very pro, you know, Seattle for everyone, let's get housing for everyone. They often are the ones that are, for whatever reason, the most NIMBY. And I think it's because, you know, they also have an anti, you know, for-profit developer bent and think that these changes are for them. And it's like, no, it's for everybody. So, yeah, I totally agree. Gotta get people saying that they want this in their neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Now I can think of the example when the original maps first came out of the upzoning for the transit and neighborhood commercial centers. Roosevelt was like, wait, we need more density here. We need more height. We're going to have transit. Like, this is the time to get more. And they got a little bit more, but the community didn't actually get as much as they wanted. But they did get more because they said they wanted it. So yeah, it goes back to what Amy said, is you need to ask for it at the local level so that the city council members will go advocate for it.
Great, thank you all. And I know that Seattle for Everyone is thinking about the 2024 Major Comprehensive Plan update as a vehicle for some of these changes. I mean, just the conversation itself is super important. So that is also something that we're looking towards. So to take the next question here, it's about MFTE. So I wonder why we're putting so much emphasis on MFT, which is only affordable in the short term and often both rent burden tenants and restricts them from saving money and thereby restricts them from gaining wealth and ability to move up. So yeah, essentially the question is, why is there this big focus on MFTE versus other programs?
So for me, I mean, from the market perspective, I mean, I think MFTE is just another tool in the toolkit, right? So it really targets for a specific time. You're totally right. You know, the workforce housing between 60 and 80 AMI, depending on your city, sometimes up to 100. So and it was also actually created as an economic development tool, like Brady said at the beginning. So it was, I think it's different now because it's about affordable housing, but you know, it does not solve all of the problems. It does not, because it does not get to the deeper levels of affordability that some folks need.
In my opinion, I'll just tack on, I totally agree. It's an entry point. It's just an entry point for people into the system to get that affordable startup. Ideally, it's not ideal, and everyone can agree with that. I think what would be more ideal is entry point home ownership opportunities, which we've talked about a little bit. So, but in order for us to do that, we've got to pass some legislation and start looking creatively at things like co-housing, at, you know, how do we bring townhomes back? There's affordability issues around that. We have a lot of them. People hate them, I get it, but it is an affordable opportunity. Things like condos. So how do we find those home ownership? Because that's ideal. That would be the perfect place to start, because then again, people can build equity. And I agree. But for now, until we figure out how to make those home ownership opportunities available, I think MFTE is the most likely starting point that has the most political will behind it.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So I think we can probably move on to the next question. I think it was well
Great.
said.
Thank you all. So the next one is from Laura. So many folks who are pro-housing feel like their jobs mean they can't weigh in and they have to, quote, be neutral. How do you get government workers the freedom of speech about pro-housing standpoints without getting in trouble for not being neutral? And yeah, so it being a government question, if you have input there, great.
I mean, I am not a government employee, and someone else who is can respond, but I would say that I don't know that I agree with this. I mean, I work with a lot of employees of different cities, and they, I think, are some of the best bold leadership that we have towards saying out loud, we have a problem, we're going to work together to fix it. What kinds of tools can we create? And really not being neutral on the sidelines, really being very clear about the problem and wanting to be part of the solution to the extent that they have the tools to do so.
Agree.
Okay. Thank you all. So another question from Nathan here. What can we do to encourage more affordable townhomes? Folks in Crown Hill are complaining that the land there that has recently been upzoned from single family to low rise is being redeveloped with townhouses in the 800,000 to 1 million range.
I mean, I think MFTE for, you know, a really good program that encourages ownership in MFTE is a great way to start, right? Mm-hmm. The ownership affordability is the hardest one. Mm-hmm. I think we all know, and there, you know, I think you all, Amy and Emily, you can speak better to this, but you know, there are land trust solutions, things like that, really creative situations, but they really tend to be one-off. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So.
I agree. And I brought up the townhomes earlier. So I will say, you know, as someone who has built townhomes, they can be very expensive, but also a lot of the developers locally who build those townhomes are doing quite well. So I'll just say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's probably some policy connections that we're making with other kinds of, like the new backyard cottages, where it's sort of the pre-permitted, you know, kit that you can choose from, like what Portland did like a decade ago. But you know, maybe there's a way to tie, you know, a quicker, easier, cheaper permitting and entitlement process to an an entry affordability point that the developer has to hit, right? Like there are those tools out there, and I would agree that townhouse developers are making a lot of money. So yeah.
Cool.
We probably won't be very popular for saying that, but oh
well. So let's take one more question here, and then I'm just going to ask for a single takeaway from all of you, like what you'd want to emphasize as people are leaving. So this question here from Amy: how can we bring a more diverse group of voices into these conversations or programs? Are there plans for future panels, town halls like this that are accessible to a wider range of people, keeping in mind that working people, those with children, stable internet, et cetera? So especially that first part for you all, the how can we bring more diverse group of voices to this conversation programs? Yeah, curious to get your responses there.
So I would love to start this one if I could. I didn't ask the question, even though my name's Amy, it was different Amy. But so I'm a big believer in, we have got to have people that are impacted by this crisis at the table. And by that, I don't mean the kind of token offering of, let's have an advisory panel. And while that's great, and that's a really good start, I think we have to start elevating people with lived experience in homelessness, in poverty, in racial inequality, that sort of thing. We need those people to be in positions of leadership and authority in this discussion making. So, or in the discussion. So for example, Weld in 1426, we want this building to be a centerpiece, a place in the community where these conversations can happen. Weld is entirely run by people with lived experience. Even our executive director has criminal justice experience, addiction experience, homelessness experience, and he leads the programs. He builds and develops them out of his personal experience. We have to put these people in positions of leadership, which then brings them to the table, because who gets invited to these conversations? People that are in leadership. So I think it's really important. We have to start investing in the communities of color. That's obvious. We have to start investing in people with criminal backgrounds, investing in people with lived experience with homelessness, and ask them, teach us to make this go away. What do we need to do to solve this problem from your perspective when you've walked this road?
Great. Well, thank you for that. And then to the second part of this question, just we got to move on to this last little bit. But are there plans to have future panels, town halls? I can answer that from my perspective. There aren't currently, but I think that this is exactly the sort of thing that we want to do. So yes, that is the sort of thing that we're looking to do in the future. And if there's interest in that, absolutely. So yeah, that's, thank you for asking that question. And so I just want to ask each of our panelists in the last 2 minutes that we have, what is the major takeaway that you hope that people will leave with? And let's start with, let's start with Amy, and then we'll go Emily, and then close out with Jesse.
Okay. I think, the biggest thing that I always come away from things like this is that, we often think about developers and real estate as being the devil and being the bad guy in this scenario. And the more I learn, the more I realize that that's just not the case. And we cannot solve this without developers at the table, both market rate and affordable and nonprofit. It's going to take all of us to solve the problem. I do think we have to really think about and look at the finance groups. Who's financing this? Who are the bankers? Who are the lenders? Maybe we're pointing our fingers at the wrong person, or maybe it's not one person, maybe it's a lot of people. So as we think about this, we have to think about it really broadly and creatively and look at all the areas that are impacting housing supply, not just the developers. It's 99% of the time not their fault.
I'm having tech issue. Can you guys hear me? Okay, I can't hear you, but if you can hear me. I will build on actually what Amy said. When I meet new people and they ask what I do for a living, I say I'm a real estate developer, and they sort of start to get a scowl on their face. I'm one of the good guys, though. I'm building affordable housing for low-income families and seniors. And then they go, oh, okay, good. We can like you, and that's not the right thing. We need to treat all developers as partners in solving these issues that we have, solving this housing crisis. And I think that it's clear to me that there are a lot of really smart people working on this issue, public officials, city officials, and developers, and other people, but we really just need to be more bold. We need to do things like get rid of design review. We need to do things like when in our breakout there was a discussion of we need to get rid of SEPA for in certain areas. So we need to think more boldly rather than picking around the edges and making small changes that affect certain projects. But really, I think, Jesse, one of your slides was fix it at the front end, not on a project related on the back end. And I think that will help more projects and will create more certainty in the development process and will create more units, quite frankly. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I echo everything that you all said. I think, for-profit real estate developers definitely have a PR problem. It's kind of funny, but it's not funny because it contributes exactly to the NIMBYism that then contributes to people showing up against either individual projects or to their council members for code changes or against code changes. And then it leads to the lack of political will for systemic change. And I think we've got to really flip that. So, if developers need to do a better job of PR and actually, telling people what they do, or how they contribute to all of these issues, or, doing more to contribute to those issues, I think, that would be helpful. And then again, the bold action, I just want people to take a step back and ask themselves when you see a regulation, like, why is it there? Like, what is this for? Who came up with this crazy idea? And then, deconstructing that and, do we really need that anymore? Is that serving what our needs are as a community now? And I would posit that many of them, probably you could put me out of a job and get the land use code down to one chapter and, and then we'd have some pretty good fixes in place. So yeah, but thank you for having us. This was really fun.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I know we went a little over, but really appreciate everyone who came. And thank you again to our panelists. So have a lovely day, everyone, and enjoy the rest of Affordable Housing Week. So cheers.
Thanks, Brady.
Bye.
Thank you.